Captain Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the briefing room at Forward Operating Base Thunder, her eyes fixed straight ahead while Colonel Harrison's words cut through her like shrapnel. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls lined with maps of Afghanistan's treacherous terrain. Martinez, your performance during last week's extraction mission was unacceptable, Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment that had become all too familiar to Sarah. You hesitated during a critical moment when Second Lieutenant Johnson needed immediate evacuation. Those 3 seconds of indecision could have cost lives. Sarah felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had graduated top of her class from flight school, had logged more training hours than most of her male counterparts, and had dreamed of this moment since she was 8 years old watching military helicopters fly over her childhood home in Texas. But here, in the real world of combat aviation, her dreams seemed to be crumbling faster than she could catch the pieces. "Sir, the landing zone was compromised," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I was assessing the threat level before committing to the landing." Assessing the threat level? Colonel Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "Martinez, in combat zones, we don't have the luxury of extended assessments. We make decisions quickly, and we live with the consequences. Your job is to get our people out of harm's way, not to second-guess every decision." The other pilots in the room exchanged glances. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others judgmental. She had become the cautionary tale they whispered about in the mess hall. The pilot who thought too much. The pilot who couldn't pull the trigger when it counted. Major David Chun, her direct supervisor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been her advocate since she arrived at Thunder 6 months ago, but even his support seemed to be waning. "Sarah," he said, his tone gentler than the colonel's, but no less serious, "we need pilots who can react instinctively in crisis situations. The mountains don't give us room for error." After the briefing, Sarah walked across the dusty compound toward the helicopter hangar. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly, and the mountains in the distance shimmered like a mirage. She had always found peace around aircraft, but lately, even that sanctuary felt tainted by doubt. Inside the hangar, her crew chief, Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, was performing maintenance on their Black Hawk. Rodriguez had been working on helicopters for 15 years and had seen more combat than most infantry soldiers. She looked up as Sarah approached, wiping grease from her hands with a worn cloth. "Rough briefing?" Rodriguez asked, not needing an answer. "Word traveled fast on a military base." "They think I'm dead weight," Sarah said, running her hand along the helicopter's fuselage. The metal was warm from the sun, familiar and comforting under her touch. "Dead weight doesn't graduate first in their class," Rodriguez replied matter-of-factly. "Dead weight doesn't volunteer for the most dangerous assignments. You know what your problem is, Martinez?" Sarah looked at her crew chief, grateful for someone who didn't seem ready to write her off completely. "You think too much about what could go wrong instead of trusting your training," Rodriguez continued. "In flight school, everything is controlled, predictable. Out here, chaos is the only constant. You got to learn to dance with the uncertainty." That evening, Sarah sat in her small quarters, staring at a photo of her family back home in San Antonio. Her father, a retired Army mechanic, had always encouraged her dreams of flying. Her mother, a nurse, had taught her the value of helping others. Her younger brother Miguel was just starting college, proud to tell everyone that his sister was a military pilot. She picked up her phone and dialed home. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Mija, how are you?" Her mother's warm voice carried across the thousands of miles. "I'm okay," Sarah lied, not wanting to worry her family. "Just tired. You sound different. What's wrong?" Sarah closed her eyes. Her mother had always been able to read her, even from halfway around the world. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm cut out for this," Sarah admitted. "Maybe everyone's right. Maybe I don't have what it takes." "Sarah Elena Martinez," her mother said, using her full name the way she had when Sarah was a child. "Do you remember when you were 10 and you wanted to quit piano lessons because the other kids were learning faster? Mom, this is different. Is it? You told me then that you weren't good enough, that you'd never be able to play like the other children. But you kept practicing. You kept trying. And by the end of the year, you were playing pieces that made grown-ups cry. Sarah smiled despite herself. She remembered those piano recitals, the way her hands had shaken before each performance, the way triumph felt when she finished a difficult piece without mistakes. The difference between good pilots and great pilots isn't natural talent, her mother continued. It's the willingness to keep going when everything inside tells you to quit. You've always had that, Mija. Don't let them take it away from you. After hanging up, Sarah walked out to the helicopter pad. The base was quiet except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional radio chatter from the operations center. She climbed into her Black Hawk and sat in the pilot's seat, her hands resting on the controls that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes and ran through emergency procedures in her mind, the way she had done every night since arriving in Afghanistan. Engine failure at altitude, hydraulic system malfunction, enemy fire damage. Each scenario played out in her head with mechanical precision, but she realized that Rodriguez was right. She was so focused on what could go wrong that she wasn't trusting what could go right. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Intelligence had reported Taliban movement in the Kunar province, and a convoy of Marines was being deployed to investigate potential weapons caches in a remote village. Sarah's unit was assigned to provide air support and emergency extraction capabilities. As she prepped for the mission, Sarah noticed something different in the way her crew moved around the aircraft. Rodriguez worked with her usual efficiency, but there was an extra attention to detail, as if she sensed that this mission might be different. Specialist Marcus Thompson, their door gunner, checked and rechecked his weapon systems. Martinez. Major Chin approached as she completed her pre-flight inspection. I want you to know that this mission could be your last chance to prove yourself. Command is considering reassigning you to transport duties. Transport duties. The military equivalent of being put out to pasture. Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I understand, sir. Do you? Chin's expression softened slightly. Sarah, you're one of the best technical pilots I've ever seen. Your knowledge of aircraft systems is exceptional. Your flight planning is meticulous, and your safety record is spotless. But out here, we need pilots who can make split-second decisions under fire. We need cowboys, not engineers. As the convoy rolled out of the base, Sarah lifted off in formation with 3 other Black Hawks. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, ancient and indifferent to the human drama playing out in their shadows. She tried to push Chin's words out of her mind and focus on the mission ahead. The village they were investigating sat in a valley surrounded by steep ridges that provided perfect cover for ambushes. Sarah had studied the terrain extensively the night before, memorizing every possible landing zone, every escape route, every potential threat position. Her thorough preparation had become both her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. The Marines established a perimeter around the village while Sarah and the other helicopters maintained overwatch from above. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded normally. The villagers were cooperative, the searches were methodical, and the radios crackled with routine updates. Then, everything went wrong. The first rocket-propelled grenade came from a northern ridge, streaking across the valley like a deadly comet. Sarah watched in horror as it missed the lead helicopter by mere feet, exploding against the mountainside in a shower of rock and flame. Taking fire, came the urgent radio call from Captain Brooks in the lead aircraft. Multiple RPGs from the ridgeline. The ambush had been perfectly planned. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves in hidden caves along the ridge, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. Now rockets and small arms fire erupted from seemingly every direction, turning the peaceful valley into a killing field. Sarah's training kicked in as she banked hard to the right, avoiding another RPG that passed directly through the space her helicopter had occupied seconds before. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, but her mind was racing through calculations and contingencies. Martinez, get those Marines out of there. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled over the radio from the command center back at base. Sarah looked down at the village below. The Marines had taken cover wherever they could find it, but they were pinned down by accurate fire from the ridges. Their original extraction point was now completely compromised, swept by overlapping fields of fire that would turn any landing into suicide. This was the moment she had trained for, the moment that would define her career and possibly her life. Sarah felt the familiar paralysis of overthinking begin to creep in, the careful analysis that had served her so well in training, but had become her greatest enemy in combat. Below her, 47 Marines were counting on her to make the right decision. Above her, her superiors were waiting to see if she would finally prove herself worthy of their trust. And inside her, a voice that sounded remarkably like her mother's was whispering that some moments require you to stop thinking and start believing. The sound of her crew chief's voice over the intercom snapped Sarah back to the immediate reality of the crisis unfolding below. Martinez, we've got Marines taking heavy fire at grid reference 42S, PB, 1234-5678. They need extraction now. Sarah banked her Black Hawk into a tight turn, scanning the valley floor for any possible landing zone that wasn't under direct enemy observation. The terrain was unforgiving, with steep slopes covered in loose rocks and scattered boulders that could destroy a helicopter's landing gear in seconds. Every flat spot that could accommodate her aircraft was either too small, too exposed, or already being targeted by Taliban fighters. Through her headset, she could hear the desperate radio traffic from the ground forces. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the Marine squad leader, was coordinating his men's defensive positions while calling for immediate air support. Apache 1-7, this is Ground Team Alpha. We are taking accurate fire from multiple positions. Request immediate suppression of targets on the northern ridge. Over. The Apache attack helicopters that had been providing overwatch swooped down like mechanical hawks, their 30mm chain guns chattering as they engaged the hidden enemy positions. Explosions bloomed along the ridgeline, but the Taliban fighters were well concealed in caves and natural rock formations that provided excellent protection from air attack. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical situation. The original landing zone was a small clearing about 200 meters from the village center. It had been perfect for a routine insertion, but now it was a death trap. Enemy fighters had clear lines of sight from multiple positions, and any helicopter attempting to land that would be destroyed before it touched down. She needed to find another option, and she needed to find it fast. Her fuel was at 60% and dropping steadily as she maneuvered to avoid enemy fire. More importantly, the Marines on the ground were running low on ammunition and had multiple casualties that needed immediate medical attention. Martinez, what's your status? Major Chin's voice came through the radio, tense with urgency. I'm searching for an alternate landing zone, sir. The primary LZ is compromised. We don't have time for searching, Martinez. Those Marines need extraction now. Sarah gritted her teeth, fighting the familiar surge of anxiety that threatened to cloud her judgment. She forced herself to focus on the terrain below, methodically examining every possible option. There had to be a way. There was always a way. Then she saw it. About 400 meters south of the village, there was a narrow strip of relatively flat ground next to a dry riverbed. It was barely wide enough for a helicopter, and it was surrounded by tall rocks that would make the approach extremely dangerous. But it was also hidden from most of the enemy positions by a natural ridge that ran parallel to the valley floor. The problem was getting the Marines to that location. They would have to move across open ground under enemy fire, carrying their wounded with them. It would be a nightmare fighting withdrawal under the worst possible conditions. But it might be their only chance. Sarah keyed her radio. Ground Team Alpha, this is Dustoff 27. I have a possible extraction point at grid reference 42S, PB 1245-5634. It's 400 meters south of your current position, but you'll have to move under fire to reach it. There was a long pause before Staff Sergeant Torres responded. Dustoff 27, that's a lot of open ground to cover with wounded. Can you provide covering fire during our movement? Sarah looked at her door gunner, Specialist Thompson, who was already checking his M240 machine gun. The young soldier gave her a thumbs up, but she could see the concern in his eyes. They would be flying low and slow during the extraction, making themselves an easy target for every enemy fighter in the valley. Affirmative, Ground Team Alpha. I'll provide what cover I can, but you'll need to move fast. As Sarah began her approach to the improvised landing zone, she could see the Marines beginning to organize their withdrawal. They moved with the disciplined efficiency of professional soldiers, but she could also see the desperation in their movements. Several men were clearly wounded, being helped by their squad mates. Others were laying down, suppressing fire to keep the enemy's heads down. The approach to the riverbed landing zone was even more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. She had to thread her helicopter between two large rock formations, with barely 10 feet of clearance on either side. The slightest miscalculation would send them crashing into the mountainside. "Easy does it, boss." Rodriguez's voice was calm and professional over the intercom. "You've got 8 feet clearance on the left, 12 on the right. Altitude looks good." Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. This was what all those hours of training had been for. The complex emergency procedures, the night flying exercises, the simulation of every possible malfunction and crisis scenario. Her instructors had drilled into her that when everything went wrong, you fell back on your training. But as she settled the Black Hawk into the narrow landing zone, Sarah realized that her training had only taken her so far. Everything from this point forward would require the kind of instinctive decision-making that couldn't be taught in a classroom. The Marines began their fighting withdrawal across the open ground, moving in bounds while their squad mates provided covering fire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions as Taliban fighters tried to cut down the retreating Americans. Bullets sparked off rocks and sent up small geysers of dirt as they impacted near the moving figures. "Thompson, light them up," Sarah ordered her door gunner. The M240 machine gun opened up with its distinctive hammering sound, sending long bursts of 7.62 mm rounds toward the enemy positions. Sarah could see her tracers arcing across the valley, and she maneuvered the helicopter to give Thompson the best possible angle of fire. But the enemy fire was intensifying. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her aircraft, and she saw several impact marks appear on the helicopter's armored floor. One round spiderwebbed the right side window, sending a network of cracks across her field of vision. The first group of Marines reached the landing zone, half carrying a wounded soldier whose leg was covered in blood-soaked bandages. Rodriguez immediately jumped out to help load the casualties while Thompson continued to lay down, covering fire. "We've got 4 wounded, 2 serious," Rodriguez called over the intercom. "Loading now." Sarah held the helicopter steady despite the increasing enemy fire. She could feel the aircraft shudder as rounds impacted the fuselage, and warning lights were beginning to flash on her instrument panel. The hydraulic pressure was fluctuating, indicating possible damage to the flight control systems. The second group of Marines was halfway to the landing zone when disaster struck. A rocket-propelled grenade, fired from a concealed position on the eastern ridge, streaked across the valley and exploded against the rocks just 50 meters from Sarah's helicopter. The concussion wave rocked the aircraft violently, and shrapnel peppered the tail boom. "We're hit," Thompson called out. "Tail rotor taking damage." Sarah felt the helicopter's nose begin to swing to the right as the damaged tail rotor struggled to maintain directional control. She compensated with aggressive pedal inputs, but she could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly unstable. They needed to get out of there immediately, but half the Marines were still exposed in the open ground. Through a cracked window, Sarah could see Staff Sergeant Torres waving his men forward while firing his rifle at the enemy positions. He was standing completely exposed, drawing fire to himself to give his wounded Marines a better chance of reaching safety. It was the kind of selfless courage that defined the best of the American military, and Sarah knew that she couldn't abandon these men. "Rodriguez, how many more?" she called over the intercom. "Still got 12 Marines inbound, including Torres. The wounded are loaded, but we're running out of room." Sarah did a quick calculation. Her Black Hawk was rated to carry 11 passengers in normal conditions, but she already had 15 Marines crammed into the cargo compartment. Adding 12 more would put them dangerously overweight, especially with the aircraft already damaged and losing fuel. But leaving anyone behind was not an option. "Load them all," Sarah ordered. "We'll make it work." The next few minutes felt like hours. Marines continued to pile into the helicopter while enemy fire intensified around them. Sarah could hear Rodriguez shouting instructions, trying to pack as many men as possible into the limited space. Some Marines were sitting on others' laps, and several had to stand, holding on to whatever they could find for support. Torres was the last man to reach the helicopter. As he dove into the cargo compartment, another RPG exploded nearby, this one close enough to pepper the aircraft with metal fragments. Sarah felt something hot tear through her flight suit, and she looked down to see blood seeping from a small shrapnel wound in her left arm. "That's everyone," Rodriguez called. "We are way over max gross weight, but everyone's aboard." Sarah pulled up on the collective, trying to lift the overloaded helicopter out of the landing zone. The aircraft strained against the excessive weight, and the damaged tail rotor made directional control extremely difficult. They barely cleared the surrounding rocks, and Sarah could feel the helicopter wallowing in the thin mountain air. Worse yet, the warning lights on her instrument panel were multiplying rapidly. Oil pressure was dropping in the number 2 engine. The transmission temperature was climbing toward the red line, and the fuel flow indicator showed that they were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. As they climbed laboriously out of the valley, Sarah realized that their troubles were just beginning. They were flying a damaged aircraft that was loaded far beyond its design limits. They were rapidly running out of fuel, and they still had to navigate through some of the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan to reach safety. But for the first time since arriving in country, Sarah wasn't thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Instead, she was focused entirely on the one thing that had to go right: getting these Marines home alive. The Black Hawk lurched violently as Sarah fought to maintain control for the mountain passes. 27 Marines were crammed into a cargo compartment designed for 11, their combined weight pushing the helicopter far beyond safe operating limits. Every control input felt sluggish, and the aircraft responded like a wounded animal struggling to stay airborne. "Martinez, what's your fuel status?" Major Chin's voice crackled through the radio, barely audible over the sound of the straining engines. Sarah glanced at her fuel gauges and felt her heart sink. The numbers were dropping faster than they should, indicating that shrapnel had likely punctured one of the fuel tanks. At their current burn rate, they had maybe 15 minutes of flying time left, but forward operating base Thunder was still 20 minutes away. "Fuel is critical, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the growing desperation of their situation. "We may need to consider alternate landing sites." In the cargo compartment behind her, Staff Sergeant Torres was doing his best to treat the wounded Marines with limited medical supplies. 2 men had serious injuries that required immediate surgical attention, and several others were losing blood from shrapnel wounds. Every minute they remained airborne was a minute closer to losing someone. Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, strained but professional. "Boss, I'm seeing hydraulic fluid leaking from multiple locations. The flight controls are going to get progressively harder to manage." As if to emphasize her point, the helicopter suddenly yawed hard to the left as the damaged tail rotor struggled to maintain directional control. Sarah corrected with aggressive pedal inputs, but she could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly unstable with each passing moment. Through her cracked windscreen, Sarah could see the familiar landmarks of the Khyner province spread out below. These mountains have been home to conflict for centuries, their ancient peaks silent witnesses to countless battles between empires and tribes, foreign invaders, and local defenders. Today, they might witness the final flight of an American helicopter and the Marines it carried. But Sarah wasn't ready to become another casualty statistic, not with 27 lives depending on her ability to keep this damaged machine in the air. She began calculating alternatives. Camp Blessing was closer than Thunder, but its medical facilities were limited. Bagram Airfield had excellent trauma surgeons, but it was too far away with their current fuel situation. There was a small forward operating base called Chapman about 8 minutes to the southeast, but she wasn't sure if their landing pad could accommodate a Black Hawk. "Rodriguez, give me the radio frequency for FOB Chapman," Sarah called over the intercom. "Copy that, boss." Switching to their approach frequency now. Sarah keyed the radio microphone. Chapman Tower. This is Dustoff 27. Emergency inbound with 27 souls on board. We have critical fuel state and multiple wounded requiring immediate medical attention. The response came immediately, the air traffic controller's voice tight with urgency. Dustoff 27, Chapman Tower. We copy your emergency. Be advised, our landing pad is marginal for Black Hawks, and we're reporting crosswinds at 15 knots gusting to 25. Crosswinds, as if their situation wasn't challenging enough. Landing an overloaded, damaged helicopter in strong crosswinds would require every bit of skill Sarah had learned in her years of training. But it wasn't like they had any other options. Chapman Tower, I'll take what you've got. Request immediate medical team standing by. Roger, Dustoff 27. Medical team is being assembled. Be advised, you'll be landing on a gravel pad approximately 75 feet square. Obstacles include a communications tower to the north and a fuel storage area to the south. Sarah could picture the landing zone in her mind. Tight quarters, obstacles on multiple sides, and crosswinds that would try to push her aircraft off course during the most critical phase of flight. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging approach. With her current aircraft condition and passenger load, it was borderline impossible. But, as her instructor back in flight school used to say, impossible was just another word for something nobody had figured out how to do yet. The number 2 engine temperature was now climbing steadily into the red zone, indicating that the cooling system had been damaged during their escape from the valley. Sarah reduced power on that engine and compensated by increasing power on the number 1 engine, but the asymmetric thrust made the helicopter even more difficult to control. Behind her, she could hear Torres talking to his wounded Marines, his voice calm and reassuring despite the desperate situation they all faced. Hang in there, Johnson. We're almost home. Just keep pressure on that wound and stay with me. Sarah thought about her conversation with her mother the night before, about the piano lessons and the importance of not giving up when things got difficult. But this was different from struggling to learn a difficult musical piece. This time, people would die if she made a mistake. The familiar voice of doubt began to creep into her mind. What if she misjudged the approach? What if the crosswinds were too strong? What if the landing pad was too small? What if the helicopter broke apart from the structural stress before they could touch down? For a moment, Sarah felt the paralysis of overthinking begin to take hold, the careful analysis that had served her so well in training, but had become her greatest enemy in combat situations. She could feel her hands beginning to tense on the controls, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Then she heard Rodriguez's voice over the intercom, steady and confident. Boss, I've been flying with you for 6 months. I've seen you land this bird in sandstorms, on mountainsides, and in places that would make most pilots wet themselves. Whatever's ahead of us, I know you can handle it. The simple statement of faith from her crew chief cut through Sarah's self-doubt like a blade. Rodriguez had seen hundreds of pilots come and go during her 15 years of service. She didn't offer reassurance lightly, and she certainly didn't stake her life on platitudes. Sarah took a deep breath and forced herself to focus on the immediate task ahead. The approach to FOB Chapman would require precise control inputs, careful power management, and the kind of instinctive flying that couldn't be taught in a classroom. She would have to trust her training, trust her instincts, and trust the battered helicopter to hold together for just a few more minutes. Chapman Tower, Dustoff 27, is 5 minutes out. Request winds and traffic advisories. Dustoff 27, winds are now 200 degrees at 18 knots, gusting to 28. No other traffic in the pattern. Fire and rescue teams are standing by. Sarah could see the base ahead, a small collection of concrete buildings and sandbag barriers carved out of the mountainside. The landing pad was exactly as advertised, a tiny gravel square surrounded by obstacles and swept by gusty crosswinds that would make even a normal approach challenging. All right, everyone, Sarah announced over the intercom. We're going in. This is going to be rough, so hold on to whatever you can find. She began her descent toward the base, fighting the crosswinds that tried to push the helicopter off course. The overloaded aircraft responded sluggishly to her control inputs, and she had to use aggressive corrective movements to maintain her approach path. At 200 feet above the ground, the number 2 engine temperature alarm began blaring in her headphones. The engine was on the verge of complete failure, but shutting it down now would make the approach even more dangerous. She had to keep it running until they were safely on the ground. At 100 feet, a particularly strong gust of wind caught the helicopter and pushed it 20 feet to the right of the landing pad. Sarah corrected aggressively, but the overcorrection sent them swinging back toward the communications tower on the north side of the pad. "Easy, boss." Rodriguez's voice was calm over the intercom. "You've got room. Just let it settle." Sarah fought every instinct that told her to abort the approach and try again. They didn't have fuel for a second attempt, and the wounded Marines couldn't wait any longer. This was their one chance, and it had to work. At 50 feet, she could see the ground crew scrambling to clear the landing area. Medical personnel were standing by with stretchers and trauma equipment, ready to receive the wounded as soon as the helicopter touched down. At 20 feet, another gust of wind rocked the aircraft violently. Sarah felt the controls go mushy as the helicopter entered what pilots called settling with power, a dangerous condition where the rotor blades were recycling their own downwash and losing lift. For a terrifying moment, the aircraft dropped like a stone toward the unforgiving gravel below. But years of training took over. Sarah lowered the nose slightly to regain airspeed, pulled in more collective to arrest the descent, and used aggressive pedal inputs to keep the helicopter aligned with the landing pad. The maneuver cost them precious altitude, but it restored clean airflow over the rotor blades. As the wheels touched down on the gravel pad with a bone-jarring impact, Sarah realized that she had done something she had never quite managed before. She had stopped thinking about all the things that could go wrong and had simply trusted her ability to make things go right. The engines were still running, but she could see steam rising from the number 2 engine compartment. They had made it, but just barely, any longer in the air, and the helicopter would have come apart around them. Medical personnel swarmed the aircraft as soon as the rotors stopped turning. Wounded Marines were carefully extracted from the crowded cargo compartment and loaded onto stretchers. Sarah watched through her window as the most seriously injured were rushed toward the base medical facility, and she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. They had all made it home alive. The silence after the engines shut down was deafening. Sarah sat in the pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the controls, watching as medics carried the wounded Marines toward the field hospital. Steam continued to rise from the damaged engine compartment, and she could smell the acrid scent of overheated metal and hydraulic fluid. Rodriguez appeared at her window, her face streaked with grease and concern. "Boss, you okay? You've got blood on your sleeve." Sarah looked down at her flight suit, surprised to see the dark stains spreading from the shrapnel wound in her left arm. In the intensity of the flight, she had completely forgotten about the injury. The pain came rushing back now, a sharp burning sensation that made her wince. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Just a scratch." "Like hell it's just a scratch," Rodriguez replied. "You need to get that looked at." As Sarah climbed out of the helicopter, her legs felt unsteady beneath her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis was beginning to fade, leaving behind a profound exhaustion that seemed to reach into her bones. She looked back at her aircraft, really seeing the damage for the first time. The Black Hawk looked like it had been through a war zone, which, Sarah reflected, it had. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage, the right side window was spiderwebbed with cracks, and hydraulic fluid had left dark stains along the belly of the aircraft. The tail rotor showed obvious signs of shrapnel damage, with several twisted blades that would need complete replacement. Major Chin's voice crackled over her radio. "Martinez, this is Thunderbase. What's your status?" Sarah keyed her radio with trembling fingers. "Thunderbase, Dustoff 27 is on the ground at Chapman. All personnel delivered safely. Aircraft is heavily damaged, but crew is uninjured." "Outstanding work, Martinez. We're dispatching a maintenance team to assess the aircraft. Medical reports indicate all wounded are stable and receiving appropriate care." Specialist Thompson appeared beside her, his machine gun slung over his shoulder. The young door gunner's face was pale, but his eyes held a new respect that hadn't been there that morning. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "that was some of the best flying I've ever seen." Before Sarah could respond, Staff Sergeant Torres approached from the medical facility. The Marine squad leader's uniform was torn and bloody, but he walked with the steady gait of a man who had brought all his people home alive. "Captain Martinez," Torres said, extending his hand. "I don't know how you managed to fit 27 Marines in a helicopter designed for 11, but every one of my men owes you their life." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a career spent in dangerous places. "How are you wounded, Sergeant?" "Johnson's going to lose his leg below the knee, but the docs say he'll live. Garcia has some internal bleeding, but they've got him stabilized. The rest are mostly cuts and scrapes." Torres paused, studying Sarah's face. "I heard what they've been saying about you back at Thunder, about you being hesitant under fire." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Even the Marines knew about her reputation. "Well," Torres continued, "I've been in this man's army for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of pilots. Some are good, some are great, and a few are legends. What you did today puts you in the last category." Over the next several hours, as maintenance crews worked to assess the damage to her helicopter, Sarah found herself replaying the mission in her mind. But this time, instead of focusing on her mistakes and hesitations, she found herself remembering the moments when everything had clicked into place. The precision approach through the narrow canyon, the steady hand on the controls during the firefight, the perfect touchdown on a landing pad that should have been impossible to reach. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, Sarah began to understand what Rodriguez had been trying to tell her about trusting her training. Her careful, analytical approach hadn't been a weakness after all. It had simply needed to be balanced with the ability to act decisively when analysis wasn't enough. That evening, as Sarah sat in the base medical facility having her arm stitched up by a Navy corpsman, her radio crackled with an incoming message from Colonel Harrison. "Martinez, report to my office immediately upon your return to Thunder Base." The corpsman, a young man named Petty Officer Williams, looked up from his work. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying so, you look like someone who just flew through hell and back." "That's a pretty accurate assessment," Sarah replied. "Well, for what it's worth, the wounded Marines have been talking about you. They say you saved their lives when everyone else had written them off." Williams tied off the final suture and applied a clean bandage. "Sometimes being written off is the best thing that can happen to someone. It means you get to prove everyone wrong." The flight back to Forward Operating Base Thunder took place the next morning in a replacement Black Hawk. Sarah's original aircraft would need extensive repairs that would take weeks to complete, if it could be repaired at all. As they flew over the valley where the ambush had taken place, Sarah could see burn marks on the ridges where the Apache helicopters had engaged the enemy positions. When they landed at Thunder, Sarah was surprised to see a crowd of personnel gathered around the helicopter pad. Word of the rescue had spread throughout the base, and soldiers, Marines, airmen, and civilians had come out to welcome them home. As Sarah climbed out of the helicopter, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Major Chun was waiting for her, his expression unreadable. "Sarah, the colonel wants to see you immediately." As they walked toward the command center, Chun spoke quietly. "I want you to know that I've been wrong about you. What you did yesterday was extraordinary. I've never seen a pilot handle a more challenging situation with greater skill and composure." "Thank you, sir, but I was just doing my job." "No," Chin said firmly. "You were doing much more than that. You were being the kind of pilot that other pilots tell stories about." Colonel Harrison's office was crowded with senior officers from across the base. Sarah recognized the faces of men and women she had seen in briefings and meetings, but who had never paid much attention to the helicopter pilot who thought too much. "Captain Martinez," Colonel Harrison said as she entered the room. "Please have a seat." Sarah remained at attention. "Sir, I prefer to stand." "Very well." Harrison picked up a file from his desk. "I've been reviewing the after-action reports from yesterday's mission. 27 Marines extracted from a hostile landing zone under heavy fire. Aircraft damaged beyond normal operational limits. Navigation through mountain terrain in adverse weather conditions. Landing in a marginal facility with crosswinds exceeding safe parameters." Sarah waited for the criticism that was sure to come. The mission had been successful, but she had violated numerous safety protocols and flight regulations in the process. Captain Martinez, Harrison continued, I owe you an apology. We have been evaluating your performance based on peacetime standards when what we needed was a combat pilot. Your analytical approach and attention to detail aren't weaknesses in a combat environment. They're exactly what we need when lives are on the line. Sarah blinked in surprise. This wasn't the conversation she had been expecting. Furthermore, Harrison said, I've been in contact with divisional headquarters. Your actions yesterday are being considered for formal recognition. The Distinguished Flying Cross is awarded to aircrew members who distinguish themselves by heroism or extraordinary achievement while participating in an aerial flight. The room fell silent. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the military's highest awards for aviation achievement, typically reserved for actions that went far above and beyond the call of duty. Sir, Sarah said quietly, I was just trying to bring those Marines home. Exactly, Harrison replied. And in the process, you demonstrated the kind of courage and skill that defines the best of military aviation. You've shown us what it means to be a combat pilot, Captain Martinez. The question now is whether you're ready to help train others to meet that same standard. As Sarah left the colonel's office, her head spinning with the unexpected turn her career had taken, she thought about the conversation with her mother about piano lessons and perseverance. Sometimes the very qualities that others see as weaknesses turn out to be strengths in disguise. Sometimes being underestimated gives you the freedom to exceed everyone's expectations, including your own. The sun was setting over the mountains of Afghanistan, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in those mountains, Taliban fighters were probably planning their next ambush, their next attempt to kill American soldiers and Marines. But tonight, 27 Marines were alive because one pilot had learned to trust her training and her instincts. Sarah walked toward the helicopter hangar where Rodriguez was working on a replacement aircraft. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the best pilots are the ones who think carefully before they act boldly. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Martinez stood before a classroom full of young pilot trainees at Fort Rucker, Alabama. The faces looking back at her were eager and nervous, much like her own had been when she first entered flight school years earlier. But now she carried something that couldn't be taught from textbooks or demonstrated in simulators. The hard-won wisdom that comes from facing the impossible and finding a way through. The difference between good pilots and great pilots, Sarah began her lecture, isn't natural talent or perfect reflexes. It's the ability to think clearly under pressure and trust your training when everything around you is falling apart. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of her damaged Black Hawk at FOB Chapman. The students leaned forward, studying the bullet holes and twisted metal that told the story of her flight through hell. This aircraft was hit by small arms fire, shrapnel from 2 RPG explosions, and was loaded with more than twice its maximum passenger capacity. The engines were overheating, hydraulic systems were failing, and fuel was leaking from multiple punctures. By every technical standard, this helicopter should not have been able to fly. A young lieutenant in the front row raised her hand. Ma'am, how did you know it was safe to continue flying in those conditions? Sarah smiled, remembering when she would have asked the same question. Lieutenant, I didn't know it was safe. In fact, I knew it was extremely dangerous. But sometimes the greater risk is not taking any risk at all. 27 Marines were counting on me to make a decision, and paralysis wasn't an option. The months following the rescue had transformed Sarah's career in ways she never could have imagined. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony had been attended by senior officers from across the military, and her story had become legendary within the aviation community. More importantly, her approach to training new pilots had revolutionized how the military thought about preparing aircrew for combat operations. Sarah's teaching methodology combined traditional technical training with realistic scenario-based exercises that forced students to make decisions under pressure. She had developed simulation programs that recreated the chaos and uncertainty of real combat situations, teaching pilots how to think clearly when their carefully laid plans fell apart. The traditional approach to flight training focuses on following procedures and avoiding risk, Sarah explained to her students. But combat flying requires you to manage risk, not avoid it. You need to understand when it's appropriate to push the limits and when discretion is the better part of valor. After the formal lecture, Sarah often shared the more personal aspects of her journey with students who stayed behind to ask questions. She talked about the doubt and criticism she had faced, the nights when she questioned whether she belonged in a cockpit, and the importance of perseverance when everyone around you has given up. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, a young pilot from Ohio who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, approached after the other students had left. "Ma'am, I've been struggling with confidence issues during my advanced training flights. My instructors say I hesitate too much during emergency scenarios, and I'm afraid they're going to wash me out of the program." Sarah studied the young woman's face, seeing the same uncertainty and self-doubt that had once plagued her own career. "Lieutenant, tell me about your background. What made you want to be a pilot?" "I grew up on a farm in rural Ohio," Walsh replied. "My father was a crop duster, and I used to go up with him when I was a kid. Flying felt like freedom, like I could go anywhere and do anything. But here, everything feels so rigid and prescribed. I keep second-guessing myself." "That's not necessarily a weakness," Sarah said. "Some of the best pilots I know are the ones who think carefully before they act. The key is learning when to stop thinking and start trusting your instincts." She pulled up a chair beside Walsh's desk. "Let me tell you about a conversation I had with my crew chief during my first deployment. She told me that the difference between flight school and combat flying is that in school, everything is controlled and predictable. In the real world, chaos is the only constant." Sarah went on to explain how she had learned to balance analytical thinking with decisive action, how preparation and training could give you the confidence to make split-second decisions when lives were on the line. "The pilots who fail in combat aren't the ones who think too much or too little," Sarah continued. "They're the ones who can adapt when their carefully rehearsed plans meet the unpredictable reality of a crisis situation." Lieutenant Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Ma'am, how do I know when I'm ready to trust my instincts?" "You don't," Sarah replied honestly. "That's the terrifying truth about combat aviation. You never know for certain that you're making the right decision. You can only trust that your training and experience have prepared you to make the best decision possible with the information you have." That evening, Sarah called her parents back in Texas. Her father, now retired from his job as an Army mechanic, always asked about her students and her teaching responsibilities. "Mija, you sound different these days," her mother observed during their conversation. "More confident, more at peace." "I think I finally figured out what I'm supposed to be doing, Mom," Sarah replied. "I spent so long trying to be the pilot everyone else wanted me to be that I forgot to trust the pilot I actually am." Her mother's laughter carried across the miles. "Do you remember what I told you about the piano lessons? About how the best musicians aren't the ones who never make mistakes, but the ones who know how to recover when they do." "I remember. Flying is the same way, isn't it? It's not about being perfect. It's about being prepared for imperfection and having the courage to keep going anyway." Sarah thought about the 27 Marines who were alive because she had learned to stop worrying about making mistakes and started focusing on getting things right. Staff Sergeant Torres had retired from active duty and was now working as a police officer in his hometown of San Diego. He still sent her Christmas cards every year, signed by all the Marines from his squad. The wounded Marines had all recovered, though some carried permanent scars from their experiences. Johnson had indeed lost his leg below the knee, but he had been fitted with a prosthetic and was now working as a counselor for other wounded veterans. Garcia had made a full recovery and was back on active duty with a new unit. Sarah had framed a photograph that Torres had sent her from a squad reunion. All 27 Marines were gathered around a barbecue grill, their faces tanned and relaxed, their families playing in the background. On the back of the photo, Torres had written, "None of this would have been possible without the pilot who refused to leave us behind." As Sarah's reputation as an instructor grew, she began receiving invitations to speak at military academies and aviation conferences around the country. Her message was always the same, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of fear. That excellence wasn't about never failing, but about learning from failure and becoming stronger. 1 year after the rescue mission, Sarah received a call from Rodriguez, who was now stationed at a base in Germany. Her former crew chief had been promoted to sergeant major and was overseeing helicopter maintenance operations for an entire wing. "Boss, I wanted you to know that we just got a new pilot assigned to our unit," Rodriguez said. Fresh out of flight school, nervous as hell, and convinced she's not cut out for this job. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." Sarah laughed. "What did you tell her?" "Same thing I told you. That dead weight doesn't graduate first in their class. That sometimes the best pilots are the ones who think before they leap. And that the most important thing she can do is trust her training and never give up on herself." "Good advice," Sarah said. "Learned it from the best," Rodriguez replied. By the way, she asked me what it was like flying with a real hero. I told her heroes aren't born, they're made. Usually in the worst possible circumstances, when everyone else has given up hope. As Sarah hung up the phone, she walked outside to watch the sunset over the Alabama countryside. In a few hours, she would be back in a classroom, teaching another group of young pilots how to handle the impossible situations that combat aviation would inevitably throw at them. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this point, from the uncertain young pilot who had been labeled dead weight to the instructor who was now helping to shape the next generation of military aviators. The path hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when she had wanted to give up entirely. But she had learned that sometimes being written off is the best thing that can happen to someone. It gives you the freedom to exceed everyone's expectations, including your own. It teaches you that the opinions of others matter far less than your own willingness to keep trying when everything seems hopeless. 27 Marines were alive today because one pilot had learned to trust herself when no one else would. And now, dozens of young aviators were learning the same lesson. That true courage isn't about being fearless, but about acting with purpose and conviction in spite of fear. In the distance, Sarah could hear the familiar sound of helicopter rotors as training flights returned to base. Each of those aircraft carried young pilots who were learning to navigate the complex challenges of military aviation, supported by instructors who had walked the same difficult path. Sarah smiled as she headed back inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to pass along the hard-won lessons of experience. But tonight, she was content knowing that somewhere in the world, there were people who were alive because she had refused to accept the limitations that others try to place on her. The woman they had once called dead weight had learned to fly in ways that textbooks could never teach, and now she was helping others discover that same freedom. In a world where courage was often measured in moments, Sarah Martinez had found hers in the space between doubt and action, between fear and faith, between giving up and pressing on. And in that space, miracles were possible.